Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to the View Up Here. I am your host, Canadian Glenn, and it is August 15th, 2018. Tonight, feminism and Canadian politics. Actions matter more than words. And the View Up Here welcomes back Julie S. Lalonde. Now, by any measurement you wish to use, feminism and its causes have never been more prominent than they are today. Over the past few years, especially with the utilization of social media, attention on spousal abuse, sexual assault of all kinds, open misogyny, institutional bias, consent, behavioral norms, and more have been broken open with the advent of the hashtag Why I Stayed, which highlighted spousal abuse, yes, all women, and everyday sexism, revealing misogyny. Time's Up, calling for real change, now. I'm With Her, which started in support of Hillary Clinton, but has expanded. That's our first example of co-option. Me Too, showing the proclivity of the issues. And there have been other hashtags as well. And they've changed the discourse around cultural standards. But 2015 was a watershed year for Canada and its institutions in this global feminist awakening. Jian Ghomeshi case, sexual assault in Parliament, the behaviour directed at female politicians like Catherine McKenna, Kathleen Wynne, Sandra, Jansen, Rachel Notley. There's a lot more. Now, this discussion is here and it isn't going away, nor should it. But like all things, the conditions around the issues continue to change. For many reasons. Controlling the message has never been more prominent than it is today, by all sides. Now, to amend a quote from Mahatma Gandhi, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then they co-opt you when the tide is completely turned. There's nobody in public life these days that will not declare themselves a feminist. If you don't, that's extremely uncool. An invitation to be left outside of advancement with the likely high cost, politically. But the declaration is not action. Support is not change. The hypocrisy is becoming more nuanced. Now, Julie Lalonde is an internationally recognized expert educator on violence against women, institutional gender-based bias, women's rights, and activism. She's a winner of the Governor General's Award for all her efforts. And I'm happy to have Julie back to discuss the progress, changes, because there have been some, and the co-option of feminism in Canada in 2018. Now, the first thing I'm going to do as I roll up my audio clip list, I'm going to play some audio from a walrus talk that Julie gave in Ottawa, October 24th, 2017. Now, this Walrus session had the title, Walrus Talks Disruption. Now, here's Julie explaining what she does in her own words.
Good evening. Bonsoir. My name is Julie S. Lalonde, and like a really good lapsed Catholic, I want to start with a confession. If you invite me to your party, I'm going to make it weird. That's just like a thing. I don't do it on purpose. It's unintentional. But this is usually what happens. So someone invites me somewhere where there's some level of chit-chat and networking and chatting, and folks talk about what they do for a living. Oh, I work in IT, I'm a dentist, I'm an accountant. And then folks turn to me, and I say, oh yeah, I work to end male violence against women. And there's a pause. And then people suddenly need to get a drink. They feel, oh, it's warm in here, I gotta go outside, get some air or something. And I'm like, oh, it's really nice to meet you. Also, your Halloween costume is really racist, but it was super nice to meet you. Thank you so much for coming. Yeah, I am that person at your party. And the reason why I'm that person at your party is because folks don't like to talk about the reality of violence against women. And I connect with colleagues from around the world, and they will tell you, I am the buzzkill at my parties also, so it's a universal reality. But there is a Canadian dynamic to that conversation, which is when people hear that I do work on violence against women, they ask me, oh, where? Because they assume I'm doing that work internationally. Because as Canadians, we believe that violence against women happens elsewhere. We believe that you know how those people are in their culture, and it's such a shame. Here's some money, go donate, right? That's what makes us feel comfortable. So when I tell you, and I tell people at parties, that I work to end male violence against women in a Canadian context, I am blowing up an expectation that people have. Because on the surface, gender equality is a core value that people really love and hold on to quite tight. And I think we've seen this in Canada since Ivanka's dad got elected, and we're feeling very smug about gender equality in Canada. So when you're a woman, a lady who's also a feminist, then people think you're just taking it too far. In Canada, like, we have a cool sock-wearing, like, feminist-identified prime minister, so, like, we good. You can just, like, pack it in. We're, like, totally fine. And me not wanting to pack it in means I'm taking it too far. I'm obviously super ungrateful, first of all. Like, you could live elsewhere, but you live here, you should be grateful. And therefore, the next conclusion is I just hate men. I hate men, and I'm super bitter and cynical about it, and that's why I'm just grinding against a gear that doesn't need to be grinded against anymore, because we good in Canada. For the record, I don't hate men, but I really wish they would stop sending me hate mail. That's like all I ask. That's like all I ask. It's like bare minimum. Thank you. That's a lot to ask people, just so you know. I'm still working on that. So when I'm told to be grateful that I live in Canada, I have to be the person that reminds folks that currently, in 2017, 1 in 3 women in this country will experience sexual violence in their lifetime. And every 6 days in Canada, a woman is murdered by a current or former partner. I'm not going to sit around and feel grateful about that. We have a lot of work left to do. And because people think my job is to be a buzzkill, which I joke about because in many cases it is. People are, like I said, I'm like, womp womp, like I'm that person. I will show up and I will be that person. And that's fine. But really, honestly, my job is to call out bullshit. That's what I do. I'm an expert bullshit caller. Because in Canada, we have learned that being explicitly sexist is not a very good polite thing to do, right? So saying, for example, women are just asking to be raped, faux pas. However, saying, it's just common sense that women shouldn't drink around men, sorry, common sense. That's how we say it. To say curfews and chaperones are mandatory for women, no one would politely say that in Canada. But if there's a predator on the loose, it's common sense that women should stay indoors, not go outside late at night, and to travel in pairs. It is rude in Canada to say that women shouldn't take public transit. However, when women talk about their experiences of transit and harassment that happens, we're told there's creepers on the bus, that's what the bus is, right? So, right, we've all heard it. So, that is why I am framed as the person who's constantly disrupting what makes people feel comfortable. I don't purposely go out of my way to make people uncomfortable. I actually like having conversations with people where they're nice to me and we talk about things that are nice and pleasant, but I can't deny the reality standing in front of me, and it's my job to challenge the subtext in what we hear. Challenging the idea that it is common sense that women shouldn't be safe when drinking around men is not only offensive to women, but it also means you have a very low opinion of men. And I'm going to reframe that and throw that back at you and see how that makes you feel when you frame it in that way. So it's interesting to me that I'm constantly told to be grateful, and then I'm also framed as cranky, kind of bitter, a little bit cynical, and in many ways I am. But what folks need to understand is that fundamentally, if you dedicate your life to ending violence against women, if you are a feminist, and let's be honest, if you're a woman who's a feminist, because we love male feminists, like we love them, like so much, like oh my god, the most amount. There's a reason why there's a joke, which is the feminist man walked into a bar. Why? Because it was set so low. Like that's how we live. I'm just saying, it needed to be said. So, when you're a lady who cares about women's issues, people assume that you're the person finding the negativity in everything, but in fact, feminism is inherently hopeful. By working to end violence against women, I am inherently optimistic that a better world is possible, that not all men are predators in waiting, that women do have strength and resilience to do great things in the world. I think the world can change. You don't. But I'm the disruptor, I'm the cranky one. And we have to flip that around and look at that for what it is. Because I haven't been doing this work for very long, and I haven't made a lot of friends, I'll be honest with you. People see me come into meetings and they're just like, oh, damn it. And I'm like, yes, I am here to be that. I'm like the Hermione of feminism, just gonna throw my hand up like every time, just like challenging what you're saying. Just doing it. But I haven't been doing this work for very long, and my being the Hermione of feminism has worked. So I fought Carleton University to get a sexual assault center, and Carleton University has a sexual assault center. I challenged the fact that we didn't have nurses that were performing rape kits. We didn't have enough nurses performing rape kits at Ottawa, and we do now. I fought for many years our public transit authority to say, why do we treat it as obvious that creepers are allowed on the bus and I'm not? I pay the same fare. Either I pay less or you get rid of the creepers. That's just what's up, right? And that is just me with one person doing my little piece. And so I'm constantly coming back to this idea of what if there was a little Hermione Granger feminist in every space? If we all took the time to reframe and throw back at people these common sense notions of gratitude and gender equality and all these things, look at how much we could accomplish. A lot. And so for me, the secret to doing this work is hope and courage and tenacity. I'm not going to write, be tenacious, because it's long and it's hard, but being hopeful and reframing the fact that you are constantly seen as the person bringing everybody down, but in fact, you're the only person in that room that thinks that a better world is possible. Because I think that men can do better. I know they can because I've seen it happen. And I think and know that young girls have the right to live in this country as free as young men. So for me, I want to ask you if you're okay to disrupt spaces in which you are told to shut up about it because it's awkward. It is awkward. I get that. That's my life, right? But I'm fine. You'll be fine too, right? And recognizing that, yes, being disruptive is not fun, it's not easy, it doesn't pay well or at all. Your inbox will be the stuff of nightmares. But if we are in every single space, you're not going to be the only person saying those things. You're setting a new norm in those spaces. And so I'm asking you to join me. Let's ruin some dinner parties. Let's ruin people's Halloween costumes. Let's just do it. Let's just lean into it. Because I'm telling you, if we all do this work, that won't be seen as disruptive anymore. We'll be creating the new norm. Thank you.
The view up here is very honored and glad to have Julie Lalonde back on the show. Welcome back, Julie.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Now, I know that you draw a certain amount of attention for your viewpoints on specifics and bigger issues. I think Canada's in the middle of a bigger issue right now with the expanding feminism movement, defining it, and the politics of Canada. What do you see happening out there?
Well, I see Canada being part of a global conversation about the role of feminism, the role of the women's rights movement, and I see Canada kind of being a bit ahead of the curve in many ways because we had our own kind of awakening in 2015, first with the Ghomeshi case and then with a revival of the Bill Cosby story, but then we really kind of blew open sexism, misogyny, and violence against women in all kinds of sectors, from Parliament Hill to the Deschamps report about sexual violence in the military to the sexual assault case against 2 hockey players at the University of Ottawa. And we really had this kind of widespread conversation about the reality of women experiencing discrimination in the workplace. And that continued until the Me Too movement last fall, which then became a global conversation. But we've really been talking about the experiences of women out in the world for a solid 5 years in this country. And now there seems to be kind of this global movement, this global conversation that really started on the issue of sexual violence, but I think has really expanded to sort of talk about everything from issues of pay inequality, discrimination, the workplace, on campuses. And I think it's really fruitful overall. I think there's a lot of conversation happening that I think is important. I think dialogue and breaking the silence is the first step, but it's exactly that. It's the first step. And the problem whenever a justice movement becomes trendy is that people co-opt it for their own purposes. People want to be a part of it just because it's the trend, it's the cool thing. Even just yesterday, I was reading an article about how because of Black Panther, Black women are a trend, and that's why they're on the cover of every major fashion magazine in the fall. When an entire demographic is considered a trend, that's a problem to me. But I think it speaks to the fact that you have companies operating sweatshops who are now selling shirts that say feminist or the future is female, which and on the one hand is encouraging, that it means that it's a mainstream movement, but by becoming mainstream, inevitably it gets diluted, it gets depoliticized, it becomes a consumable, little bite-sized pieces of what's actually a very political and a very radical movement.
I would have to agree with that, especially, like your little recap there with the Ottawa hockey team, other issues. There did seem to be a general openness all of a sudden. I don't know if that's perhaps because, hey, here's something new that we can capitalize on and get some clicks and get some ad revenue. I don't know if that's how it started. But as you said, it's that first step. You never really know when it's going to happen. Finally, it did. And I just want to say, like you said, the 5 years that this discussion has crept into the public space in Canada, I think the real big thing from what you said is it started out over social issues, cultural issues. But now, as you said, ooh, wait a minute, this is popular. There's mileage in this. Now it's becoming very political. I think you'd agree with that?
Absolutely. And I think back to the fall of 2015, I've been doing this work for 15 years, so I really can say with complete confidence that 2015 was a game changer of a year. Colleagues of mine who've been in this sector to end violence against women for decades, one colleague in particular has been doing this work for almost 40 years, and she really thinks of the fall of 2015 like December 6, 1989. It's sort of a marker of before and after. You couldn't deny violence against women after Polytechnic, and you couldn't deny sexual assault and the way in which survivors are mistreated by the legal system after what happened in 2015. And I do think that, I remember when the Ghomeshi story broke and people were talking about it for months, and I did countless interviews where people said, why this story? Why was it this story that made people say enough is enough? And I don't know, truthfully. I have some theories, but I think a part of it is social media. Shortly before the Ghomeshi story came to light, a woman who was a student, part of the student government at the University of Ottawa, received a number of really disgusting messages that happened through a private Facebook group by other student council members who were saying really vile, disgusting things about her, and someone took a screen grab and sent it to her, and it erupted into this massive conversation about women's experiences in government, even from student government and kind of student politics, and then these conversations around privacy. This was also around the same time as the Dalhousie dentistry student story, which many people have sort of forgotten about, but that was also a massive story that came out that year.
Yes.
And I think what happened was, I think the media grossly underestimated how much people cared. And I distinctly remember her giving an interview where she said, this is an example of rape culture on campus. And media used the term rape culture in quotation marks, and there were all these sort of polls on various news sites saying, is there such a thing as rape culture? And there was kind of scare quotes used around it. And I think they really printed that to mock her, to really be like, here's this radical woman. And then people were like, yeah, absolutely, we live in a culture that actively condones violence against women. And social media started kind of firing up. And what we know about modern journalism is that most journalists wake up in the morning and they troll social media to see what is it that people are talking about, what is it that they care about. And I think that's how we were able to take a story like Ghomeshi and really galvanize people to say, okay, we're going to talk about this now, then let's talk about this now. And if the media doesn't want to report it in the way it should be told, then we're going to tell our own stories. And that's how we had hashtags like Been Raped Never Reported, and then later on, Why I Stayed in terms of intimate partner violence, and then the Me Too hashtag. I think that social media and traditional media were sort of feeding each other in this loop where they were covering stories thinking like, nah, no one's really going to care. Social media picks it up, just catches on fire, and then traditional media realizes like, oh, wow, people do care. People are going to, we're going to get page views from this. We're going to get some traffic to our sites if we do talk about these issues. Like, there is an appetite for this conversation, and that's great. I think it's incredible. I don't think that we can ever go back to the way things were before 2015. My concern is how productive has that conversation been overall, and really challenging what I see as an educator, which is people thinking that raising awareness is the same thing as creating social change, when in fact they are not. I can tell you that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men will experience sexual violence in their lifetime. Maybe made you aware of something you didn't know, but that doesn't give you tools to change anything. And so for me, what's important now is moving the conversation into a very practical place. And I'm not seeing that happening. I'm seeing a lot of circular arguments, a lot of debating, a lot of kind of theoretical conversation, and something that I find really unproductive and downright destructive, which is this bizarre idea that feminism is a club that you are a member of, and that someone, we have yet to decide who that person is, gets to decide who is and is not in the club. And I find that conversation really exhausting. I think it's a giant waste of time, but I find myself having to engage with it because it's where things have gone in this particular conversation, whether you're talking about, can Beyonce call herself a feminist, to can Trudeau call himself a feminist, to if you are anti-choice, can you call yourself a feminist? And to me, it's not about the label of feminism, it's about the work, because lots of people don't identify with feminism for very valid reasons, and there are lots of people who are keen to wear a pin and identify with the movement who I think are not doing a damn thing to help women.
I think that's a great point. And when you say that, the first metaphor I think of is around Remembrance Day. Everybody wears a poppy. What does it really mean? Is there any connection at all? Is it because it's what you're supposed to do, etc.? I agree with that. Now, when you said that corporate media was a little surprised in 2015, don't you think they were doing what they have always done in the past? And I do agree things have changed since then, permanently, but weren't they just doing what they always do and trying to subliminally support the status quo? And we'll just carry on. But at least now with social media and the internet, at least now they're smart enough to know that they better get on the bandwagon instead of standing in front of it.
For sure, and I think the best example of that is the fact that Andrew Scheer would do an interview with Chatelaine where he would say, of course I'm a feminist. Because whether he believes that or not, I don't think it even really matters, but it's telling that he knew if I say to this magazine that I am not a feminist, that's going to be a headline, and not a good one. We see that on the red carpet all the time where actors are kind of cornered and asked, you know, are you a feminist? And it's a setup in which you're kind of trapped, especially in a soundbite culture. If you were to say no, because, well, that wouldn't necessarily make the news as much as your no. And so for me, I don't think that's a sign of progress. I think it's a sign of progress that people are recognizing the value of feminism, absolutely. But the idea that we now want everybody to identify as a feminist, regardless of what their actions look like, horrifies me. I think it sets us all back a great deal. It's not a trend. It's not about, you know, being with the cool kids. Are you doing the work? And for me, any social justice movement that is watered down enough to be about buttons and hashtags is not a social movement that is actually going to be productive. And I'm interested in productivity. I'm interested in creating change and seeing practical change. And celebrities or, you know, male politicians with horrific misogynist policies on their CV proudly declaring themselves as feminists is not something that I'm going to celebrate or that's going to help me get up in the morning.
Absolutely, I agree. We mentioned Justin Trudeau and his quote-unquote brand of feminism, but just, again, to prove how far this conversation has come, June 8th, 2018, an article in Chatelaine by Sarah Bosveld talked about the Manning Networking Conference, 10th annual in Ottawa. For the first time, they had a session regarding feminism, and it included Lisa Raitt, former MP Stella Ambler, current MP Rachel Harder, who I'm sure we will mention again in a bit, and conservative strategist Denise Sela. What did you hear? What did Sarah tell us about in that article that makes you think, wait a minute, what year is this again? Did these guys miss the train? Isn't this something like this obvious where the co-option is? Yeah, feminism exists. We're conservatives, but this is what it is. Isn't that what's happening?
I think so. I think there is absolutely the idea that, oh, feminism is trendy and we want to be on trend. We want to make conservatism cool. I mean, it's the same thing with young men wearing polo shirts and khaki pants, holding tiki torches, trying to make white supremacy cool in the United States. Like, I think it is a very smart tactic to rebrand yourself, to make yourself seem current, because especially if you're part of a conservative, and I mean that small c conservative movement, the ideas are literally to go back to a different time. Like, you are literally framing yourself as old. And the idea that, like, progress is bad because we're heading in a direction in which we're going away from these supposed core values. And so you're constantly having to work on your branding because you're trying to make yourself relevant to young people with views that most people identify with the old, with literal seniors, but also just old ideas that we've since moved past. And so, of course, it's going to be, oh, feminism is trendy, cool. But I don't think that what we in the feminist movement called liberal feminism, and that's not the party, small l liberal, which is a form of feminism that's very much focused on uplifting white women, uplifting privileged white women in particular. So things like, oh, we need more women on boards. We need more women heading Fortune 500 companies. We need more women in politics, I mean, and to some degree. So really an idea of, like, we need women to be in positions of financial power, kind of the Sheryl Sandberg lean in kind of attitude. And that, of course, ties in with the world of politics across all parties, I would say, even the NDP. But particularly within conservative movements, there's really a sense that that's what progress means. We have women in our parties, and therefore that's our form of feminism. A woman heading a file is a form of feminism, regardless of whether or not she's, you know, Michelle Rempel, who has ragingly xenophobic policies, who is known as a bully on Twitter, who makes bizarre choices like doing interviews with right-wing news outlets in the United States. But from their perspective, here's a, you know, youngish woman in politics who's kicking ass. So that's feminism to us. And how dare you question that otherwise? And that's where things get, I think, a bit more complex, because as a feminist who cares about representation of women in politics, who cares about the lack of representation of women, I absolutely want more women in politics across the board. But I also want more feminists in politics, and saying that I have to support every single thing a woman does or else I'm anti-feminist is bogus. I don't think anyone who says that actually believes what they're saying, but they think it paints you in a corner. And I, for one, have absolutely been, people have attempted to paint me into that corner several times by saying, how dare you not support her because she's a woman? Everything she does in her politics, in many cases, is anti-woman. So I'm not going to vote against my own interests just because the person involved looks like me. But that's where I think things get quite complex. And even for groups like Equal Voice, which is a nonpartisan organization that does incredible work to get more women elected in all forms of government, municipal, school boards, as much as federal government, there is that complexity where they're working with all parties, and that can be difficult when you're working with parties or with individuals who have, I would say, anti-women views, but who are themselves women. What do you do in that case? How difficult is that? I don't envy people who are in that position, that's for sure.
Well, it's, Rempel is the perfect example because, I'm just a straight male, so, my input is limited, and I'm willing to admit that. But, I remember when Michelle Rempel was the chair of the Status of Women House Committee, and yet in the House, she voted against the motion on equal pay. So, yeah, you're a feminist, are you? Why? Because you have the anatomy of a woman that makes you a feminist? I just don't buy that. If we talk about this Manning Center meeting, this is a quote from Lisa Raitt. I don't know what's happened in the past 8 years. Up until then, I was celebrated as a champion of women and a feminist in this country. Now, because I carry the capital C behind my name, suddenly I'm no longer worthy of having that title. Is that a snark, or is that actually a confession?
That's a great question. I think it could be a bit of both. I think there is absolutely that tension where we have representation versus the actual politics. And that's a balance that I think is really difficult to strike. It's a conversation that, like I said, organizations like Equal Voice have at a formal level, but that even myself, when I've worked with political parties, when I've worked with political organizations across the board, talking about issues like harassment and workplace violence, I run up against that a lot. And some of the most passionate women at the table talking about harassment on the Hill and harassment in politics are conservative women who are doing good work to address violence within politics while also perpetuating horrific policies. The best example I can think of right now is Lisa MacLeod. Lisa MacLeod is an Ottawa MPP who's now a cabinet minister under Doug Ford. She has done some incredible work in some areas. She was very outspoken about her experience and how she suffers from depression. And I think she's done a lot to really break the silence on mental illness within politics. Incredible work, not going to take that away from her. She broke the silence on Patrick Brown, and she's incredibly loyal to the party, but she spoke out behind the scenes about how Patrick Brown was being awful to women. And now that she's part of the government, she has made just bizarre comments. She's extremely xenophobic. She accused a minister who's a man of color of calling her un-Canadian and gave this condescending, kind of snarky response about how he needs to sit down, have a cup of tea, relax, and then apologize for calling her un-Canadian, which he never did. He said, then he said that he was being anti-feminist, that the Trudeau government was being misogynist towards her because they told her comments were racist, just out to left field. And then, not to mention also supporting cutting the basic income program and cutting welfare rates. So what do you do with someone like Lisa MacLeod? Here's a woman who is in politics, who's a cabinet minister. That is inherently feminist to have women in those positions of power, but nothing that she's done while she's been in that position has been good for women. What do you do? People point to Margaret Thatcher all the time as a perfect example of that, right? Progress in some ways, regressive in 1,000 other ways. But I think we have modern day examples here in Canada every day where I have to sit back and look and ask myself, like, is this progress? Is Michelle Rempel or Lisa MacLeod, like, are these women actually a sign of progress, or are they just putting forward the same archaic misogynist policies but in a different outfit?
That's true. I mean, I tend to notice that things are black and white. That's when you can tell politics has tried to muscle in on a social or cultural issue. Everything becomes black and white overnight. But things, I think the reason of the conservative women in particular, women of the Conservative Party of Canada, for their standards, I believe there has been a very quick change in the playing field. I mean, we can look from 2010, when Harper got his majority, to 2013, when Trudeau became leader of the Liberals. And then once the campaign started, with the things he was saying, we have not heard before on the political stage as part of a federal campaign. I believe that's the first time that serious feminist issues were ever brought up and made campaign issues. Well, I know there's been multiple results of that. It is in the mainstream, and it's not going away. It's now front and center in politics, which it wasn't. But what I ask you is, do you think the true motivation for that was just because it was virgin ground and there was a lot to be made there? I mean, obviously the Liberal government has followed through. It's not just all window dressing like the Ford government. That we do have gender parity in cabinet. We do have women much more advanced within the Liberal caucus. But do you think they really expected to go this far and this strong? Or was it more of, hey, let's try this, let's see where it takes us?
Well, I do think that they have gone hard on the feminist labeling because it did get traction. I think the fact that he is the first prime minister to so readily identify with feminism speaks to both progress and to male privilege. He is a handsome, young, fit white man who has a lot of charisma, who comes from a political dynasty that was also associated with charisma and diplomacy. And so it's safe for you to identify as feminist. If he was a woman, if it was our first elected female prime minister in Canada, even in this day and age, I don't know that the feminist branding would be so strong and at so much of the forefront, because when women identify with feminism, we get a very, very different response than men. So I do think that that's something that he needs to own and recognize that he has a lot of privilege in being able to make feminism his brand. I'm not even remotely at the same level of fame or power as a politician, and just being a public figure who talks about feminism, my inbox, the comment sections, my Twitter feed are a garbage fire. I receive death threats for being labeled a feminist, let alone not even using that term in my talks, for example. So I do think that we need to recognize that there's actually male privilege. It's sort of oxymoron as that sounds, and being able to identify with that. However, that being said, I'm grateful that that's the position he's taken, and I'm grateful that he's taken that position so strongly on the international stage as well. I connect with colleagues from around the globe, and they are adamant in saying that he is helping their work on the ground in their countries by going to places like the UN, G8, G7 summits, and using that language and using it in a very nonchalant kind of, what do you mean you're not a feminist? Of course I'm a feminist. Of course these are the principles I believe in. That is huge. That is a massive, massive thing to do to really normalize caring about these particular issues. And I think right now, when we're in deep with Saudi Arabia over human rights issues, when we are seeing Melania's husband maligning women around the world, not to mention his own political colleagues, the way that he's still harping on Hillary Rodham Clinton all this time later, it's not a small thing to be a prime minister, to stand up and be very strong in naming your politics as being feminist. So I'm very grateful for that. But then, of course, it always comes down to, okay, so is part of being a feminist that why did we sell arms to Saudi Arabia? Why is it that we drew the line at, human rights violations of activists and journalists when you were also giving them weapons? Is that feminist? Is it feminist to not address Indigenous issues? Is, buying a pipeline? I think that's where a lot of the things get quite complex. I think with people rightfully saying, show me your feminism, don't just talk about it. And my former colleague, the beloved Dr. Kate McIntyre, who unfortunately passed away just 2 weeks ago at the very young age of 49, was a feminist economist who just in the fall presented to the Finance Committee, the Federal Finance Committee, saying, for a feminist government, you have, I think it's 0.02% of the federal budget is allocated to status of women, which is the only ministry whose sole mandate is to help women in Canada. And so show me the money, essentially. And I think that's a very valid criticism we should have. And so that's where that complexity comes in. But as you said earlier, I agree with you. Life is shades of gray. And I don't think it's that you're either a perfect feminist or you're not allowed to be a feminist at all. I think we're all hypocritical. We're all contradictory. We're all complex people. And I don't think that I have the right to take that label away from him. But I absolutely have an obligation to hold him accountable if that's the banner under which he wants to operate.
I think that's a great answer. Absolutely. Okay, where's the beef, basically? You talk the talk, let's see you walk the walk. And I will say, to this point, he certainly has more than, as you said, just about any international leader, present or past, that I can think of. But that brings me back to this Manning Center discussion. This is a quote from Sarah Bosfeld in the article. Women who previously self-identified as feminists, many of whom had spent their careers advocating for women, found themselves recast in relation to this one man, Justin Trudeau. Now, the way the Conservatives have adapted so far was at that time, interim leader Ronna Ambrose kept referencing the Right Honourable Kim Campbell. We had the first female prime minister. Well, anybody who wants to do 20 seconds of research on that knows it's bullshit. But yet they talk this game about feminism. But we had the case where Alberta Member of Parliament Rachel Harder, who has a perfect voting record and is backed fully by organizations like Campaign Life Coalition, that was who the Conservatives proposed to be the chair for the Status of Women Committee. How can they think they can get away with this stuff?
Well, I think it begs the larger question, which is, what does it mean to be a feminist? Who gets to decide who is a feminist? I personally, for years, was adamant in saying that if you were anti-choice, then you could not identify as a feminist, until I was challenged by someone who said, okay, but what if you're racist? Do you get to be a feminist if you're racist? And I think that's a really good question. I think abortion access is an obvious feminist cause. I think it's something that I've never interacted with anyone in my circles who would disagree that you need to support abortion access if you're going to call yourself feminist. But I do think it does beg those bigger questions with, okay, what if you are transphobic? What if you don't think that trans women are women? Should you be able to identify as a feminist? What if? I think there are a lot of questions around that. But certainly, I think the Conservatives are a lot of things, but they're not dumb. And I think making sure to have a woman like Rachel elected to chair that committee was not accidental. I think they knew exactly what they were doing. I think it was purposely to have an anti-choice voice in the House, to give her some power, to give that movement some power, because they are a large part of their base. But I do think it's absolutely appropriate to object to that nomination. I'm uncomfortable with the fact that they then nominated a woman who did not want to be chair. I'm uncomfortable with that. I'm uncomfortable with sort of forcing somebody else into a role that they did not want for themselves. But I do absolutely support blocking her nomination, because it is unacceptable, in my view, in a country in which access to abortion is protected, it's legal, it's covered by various health plans, it is a right that we have as women. I can't imagine any other issue that people would be opposed to that is protected in that way that we would allow, right? I can't even, there's no equivalent in terms of issue that you would be like, yeah, even though it's protected and it's paid for and we all, poll after poll after poll after poll, even polls that are kind of right-leaning, have shown that the vast, vast, vast majority of Canadians support access to abortion. Most want more access to abortion, and even those who are opposed to abortion still believe that it has its place in society. And so to be so adamantly anti-choice in this day and age and thinking that you should have a voice on the Hill is just bananas to me.
I agree with that. And again, that brings me to Lisa Raitt in this session at the Manning Conference. She said that she was raised to be a feminist in Cape Breton with the assurance that she could succeed at anything. She grew up to become a lawyer, then was the first woman harbour master of a Canadian port, then CEO of the Toronto Port Authority. And she made a point about, she was usually the only woman in the room at this high level. And this is a quote from her. And then I get to where I believe is a very equal place, the House of Commons, where we're all paid the same, and suddenly I find myself being told by ideological factions that I'm not a feminist because I am a conservative. Well, I think the premise for her to say she believes that the House of Commons is a very equal place, I just turn her off. Like, what a ridiculous comment. Is this part of the deflection and dead cat issues that they try to use?
Yeah, I always roll my eyes when anybody, regardless of gender or background, talks about how the House of Commons or Queen's Park or whichever equivalent is like this equal playing field and it's all based on meritocracy and we all got here because, give me a break. I was presenting to a parliamentary group, nonpartisan folks from all different levels of government across the country who just cared about issues of democracy. And I got into an exchange with some ministers from the territories, for example, who were baffled that my talk about workplace harassment talked about how it's an issue of power and that power is not inherently a bad thing. We all seek power. If you're in politics, it's because you want some level of power. And these ministers were all kind of in a tough and saying, in the North, we do everything by consensus. So we don't have power. And I'm like, No, it's equal distribution of power. It's still power. You're still an MPP, you're still an MP. You're still a member of parliament, even though in your own, member of the territory, but you still come to decisions through consensus. So that doesn't mean you don't have power. And the bizarre ways in which people try to sort of minimize or in many cases try to exaggerate the level of power that they have is just fascinating to me. And I think when it comes to this conversation of gender equity issues, it certainly comes up a lot where it's like, we're all the same. And then meanwhile, it's like, well, why are there so many cases of harassment? Why are there so few women with traditionally important, powerful files? Women we're not seeing women as the defense minister. We're not seeing women as the finance ministers. So it tells you that you being there is absolutely a sign of progress. But whoa, pump the brakes a bit on this idea that we're all the same now, because we're not. I think when women talk, in Lisa Raitt's case, as you were just saying, trailblazer in many ways, absolutely. Once again, that doesn't mean that you're absolved of ever being held accountable for being shitty to women. That's not how this works. The other example I think of is Kelly Leach. Yeah. Kelly Leach, awful to women. Her policies were terrible for women, definitely terrible for women of color. You put together the barbaric practices hotline. You wanted people to pass some Canadian test or whatever. But yet, on the other hand, a trailblazer in many ways, right? Was a pediatric surgeon, one of the few women in her class in med school in Alberta. This is a woman who comes from a very conservative part of the country who was a pediatric surgeon, one of the very few in the country, let alone in her province. So absolutely, I'm not going to take that away from Kelly Leach. You're a trailblazer, and you being there and being a pediatric surgeon paved the way for other women. That is a feminist act, absolutely. But every breath you take is not inherently feminist because you did this thing once for women. And I think that's the sense that people have that I wore a shirt today that had flowers on it. That means that's a feminist. No, people really have this annoying idea that if you call yourself a feminist, or that everything you do is for feminism, or that by being a woman, every action you've ever taken benefits other women. Hell no. I mean, I can't think of a single thing that Kelly Leach did in her career in politics that helped women. Not a single thing. I think she set women back, quite frankly, with her actions. But still, there's this idea that, like, well, you're just saying that because she's a conservative. No. I'm saying that because she's racist. I don't think that I didn't support her being the leader of the party, but I would have supported Rona Ambrose. I thought Rona Ambrose was a really admirable politician in many ways, even though many of her policies I didn't agree with. I think she was moving women forward much more than someone like Kelly Leach or Lisa MacLeod is currently doing.
No, I agree with that. And the last thing I'm going to say about Lisa Raitt, her talking about how she was the first female CEO of the Toronto Port Authority. Anybody who thinks you get that job without full approval of all the rich men, give your head a shake. So, I mean, there's another question there. She tries to bring it out like, see what I did as a woman? And I immediately think, why were you, as a woman, given that? So, you're a feminist, are you? Okay. But, I mean, Rachel Harder has stuck to this black-white thing. She says she thinks Trudeau's full frontal feminist stand is shutting down discourse, dividing women, and preventing rigorous debate. This is her quote. We have a prime minister who has been very clear that there was one right way to be a woman, and he has defined it. If you don't fit in that box, shut up. That's a ridiculous characterization, is it not?
Well, first of all, I don't think anyone who believes that Trudeau, a man, gets to decide what it means to be a woman is either literally an idiot or pretending to be one. And I don't think she's an idiot. So I think she's purposely misconstruing what's going on to, once again, actually feed this idea that she's more feminist than he is, that she, I think of an example of Cheryl Gallant, who's an MP in Renfrew County, the Ottawa Valley, and how when 3 women were murdered by Basil Bruski 3 years ago, 2015 was a year, or was it 2016? Either way, it was 2-3 years ago, when they were murdered by Basil Bruski, she refused to give a statement on the fact that these women had been killed, and we don't know, but the rumor was because she didn't want to piss off the gun lobby, because she's one of the biggest supporters of the gun lobby in Canada. And when she was up for renewal at the last federal election, when she did attend one of the few debates, and she was asked, what is your position on women's issues? What are you going to do to address, the experiences of rural women, which includes high levels of poverty, high levels of violence? Her whole statement was, well, I'm a woman. That's all you need to know about my position on women's issues, is that I am a woman, and therefore I'm qualified to do this work. That's, once again, a conservative bastardization of what it means to be a feminist. And this idea, once again, that everything you do is for women because you are a woman. And so to say that because Trudeau has a position on feminism, that he's telling you how to be a woman is absurd. And it's downright offensive, quite frankly.
Well, there has been some definite pushback by prominent members of the Trudeau cabinet who are female. I mean, right around the time of this Manning conference, Minister Patty Haydu posed the question, is Trudeau saying that no one else should speak about it? Is he saying that somehow liberals hold the brand on feminism? No, he is actually acting as an ally, not just nationally, but internationally, and saying, look, we should all be talking about the equal empowerment of women. If conservative women and men want to stand up and talk about things like women's right to equal pay, they're welcome to. Now, doesn't that get to the whole point, or what the point should be?
Of course, and what I loved about Patty's comment is she also said, like, hey-oh, you were in power for over a decade. What did you do to help women? And that's to me, the bigger issue is you were there forever, and you did diddly squat to help women. In fact, you set women back. I mean, within the first few months of being in power, Stephen Harper slashed the status of women budget. I lost my job because you also said we weren't allowed to do advocacy and get federal dollars. You literally didn't want to pay people to criticize you. When I worked in government, I mean, we were told it's not called the Canadian government, it's not called the federal government. You have to change the documents to say the Harper government. I mean, there was a level of horrifying dictatorship light kind of politics going on. You didn't do a damn thing for women in those 10 years. You stopped the Court Challenges program. You cut funding to Status of Women Canada. You wouldn't let groups do advocacy. You made a law saying that people couldn't cover their faces while they protested. You tried to ban the niqab. Like, you did so many horrible things for women in the 10 years that you were in power. And now somebody comes along and is proudly fighting for women's rights, and all of a sudden you're saying, well, we're feminists too. Show me. You didn't do a damn thing for women for over a decade, and now we're trying to get caught back up to where we were years and years and years ago, and you're going to lament that feminism isn't nice to you? Well, you know, tough shit. Like, you need to be held accountable for what you did. And, you know, it's the same thing provincially here in Ontario where I live, that I remember, it's got to be at least 5 or 6 years ago, one of the last provincial elections, I attended this debate, and there was Lisa MacLeod, Yasser Naqvi, and I truly can't remember who the NDP person was. But, you know, the Liberals had been in power for quite some time at that point, and they kept being hammered on different issues. And the excuse that he kept giving was like, well, you know, the Harris years did this and this and this, and really, you know, destroyed the social safety net. And finally, someone responded with, yeah, and you've been in power for 10 years. Like, what have you done in these 10 years? And here in Ontario, you know, they passed all these laws and they passed all these policies right before the election, knowing they were going to win the election. And so what? So that we could look back on their track record and say, oh my God, they tried to do so much, and then Doug Ford cut them off. I think the Wynne government did a lot of great things for women in this country, but you can't make changes to basic income and minimum wage, which are two huge issues that impact women. You can't make those under the radar right before you're about to get the boot, and then argue that you've been fighting for us for the 15 years that you were in power, or 12 years or whatever outrageous amount of time they were there for. Like, that partisanship, like, just grinds my gears, and it's what really turns me off being involved with politics, because it doesn't matter who the party is. I think all parties are guilty of using issues like women's issues and feminism and wielding it when it's convenient for them. And then when things go poorly, kind of pointing to the previous government and blaming it all on them, regardless of how much time has passed.
I think that's a really good point, you know, because you think about all the things that Harper did against women in general, and people would bitch and complain about cuts or no access, but it was never specifically spoken about how it affected women, single mothers, poverty married couples where the woman has to work. And all these things that were cut definitely had a much bigger impact on women than men overall. But yet now, Doug Ford is doing it. You talk about cutting basic income. Well, you know that's going to harm proportionately, I would be safe in assuming, more women. Rolling back minimum wage increases, we know that's women. Why isn't the issue being played from that angle today in 2018?
Well, I mean, my angry feminist conspiracy tinfoil hat theory is that we just don't think about women until it's convenient for us, that the vast majority of decisions that are made around the globe and locally in our respective communities are made by men. And on a good day, I will say, well, you know, those are the glasses that you use to see the world, so you can't be faulted for not seeing it from my eyes. But that excuse is running thin in this day and age. As you said, it's 2018. You have to truly be living in the woods with no contact with the outside world to not have heard about the Me Too movement, to not have heard about women's stories and women's experiences of sexism. And so, of course, it's frustrating to me that women are still seen as a special interest group. I mean, I hear that all the time in any context, but especially in the world of politics, this idea that it's a special interest group. We're 51% of the population. And I think this conversation has really highlighted how women are very far from being a homogenous group. I have very little in common with most conservative women, but we are still lumped into the same umbrella of being a special interest group. That's fascinating. But it is enraging because, yeah, we know poverty is sexist around the globe. Women are more likely to be poor. Women are more likely to suffer consequences as a result of being poor. Women are more likely to be impacted by climate change, for Pete's sake. Like, there's not a single issue, social issue that I can think of in which women are not more likely to be impacted than men. And it's not to say that, people very quickly turn that around and say, I don't care about what happens to men. Of course not. But around the globe, men are in more positions of power than women are. They are the decision makers. And if we're lucky, if it's quote unquote trendy, then we'll think about women. We're having that little moment right now. But the fact that it's considered a moment and not just a shift and not just a recognition that we've been leaving women behind for thousands of years for no reason is very telling. And so for me, that's why I have no patience for these conversations around, well, who gets to call themselves a feminist? And not, like, just do the work, man. And I don't care if someone says, I do not want to identify with feminism. I think the movement is a bunch of crap. But if every single thing you do is helping women and moving us forward, then you can call yourself whatever the hell you want. I'm not, I'm all about the proof in the pudding.
That makes sense to me. And, it kind of reminds me of the same thing that certain portions of the media like to do, that try and just say matter-of-factly that all Muslims are terrorists. It's the same thing with all women are feminists, but in reverse, is it not?
I think so, or that that all women are feminists, or that all feminists think a certain way. I know lots of incredible feminists who don't want men to identify as feminists. I know lots of incredible men who do work for women who don't identify as feminists, who don't think that's a term that men should adopt. They think it's a woman's term that, I stand as allies to women. I don't care what you call it. What are you doing every day to move the marker forward? And I think that's where things actually get much more complicated, because I have zero doubt in my heart that someone like Rachel Harder absolutely believes that she's helping women. I've been doing work for abortion access in Canada for a very long time, and I have met women who absolutely believe that they are taking the feminist position by opposing abortion. In Canada, we have an organization called Pro-Woman, Pro-Life, and I've debated that woman several times in the media, and she absolutely believes that abortion is a horrible choice that ruins women's lives, and that she's not going to stand outside an abortion clinic and tell you you're making a mistake, but she's going to really kind of poison the conversation so that you would never think to do that because it's terrible for you. That's a much more complex argument, I think. And even the anti-choice movement, we think, for good reason, that it's just a bunch of, old farts standing in front of clinics with graphic signs, which it is in many cases. But I think someone like Rachel Harder really kind of puts a wrench in that plan when she's, relatively young and a woman. And I do believe in her heart that she thinks she's taking a pro-woman stance. I, of course, disagree wholeheartedly, but I have to engage with her on that issue in a very different way than I do with the men standing outside a Morgan Teller clinic who are just yelling at me as I walk by. Our strategies for defending choice have to bend and flex depending on the audience. And when you have someone who's a member of parliament who could have been the chair of the Status of Women Committee, that's a lot.
It is. And again, I think there's a general preference from parties especially to maintain not really showing those connections between different ideological desires of every party. Like you said, the Conservatives are big on, look, we're women, we're here, we're feminists. Well, no, not when you do not support feminist causes in general, never mind specifically. But as we talked about the Chatelaine article from Sarah Bosfeld, it just kind of blows my mind. That's from this June. We go back to March of 2015, before the last election. Maclean's held a day-long summit in Ottawa, and they had a discussion about it. And there was Anne McGrath, who's NDP National Director, Katie Telford, who at that time was the co-chair for Trudeau's campaign, who's now in the PMO, and Michelle Austin, who is with, I believe, Summa Strategies, but we know what color she supports. And I'm just going to read out a question here, and then I'm going to play the actual audio to the answers, and then we'll discuss them. Now, the question was, there's been a steady parade of stories about everything on Parliament Hill, from Chrystia Freeland being called out for having a little girl voice, to actual cases involving sexual harassment and allegations of sexual assault. I'm curious to know, as we move into the federal campaign, what effect has this had? Are you feeling that the increased transparency around this problem has actually been something that cast light and created a conversation? Or has it been an impediment? There's also talk about the idea of legislatures making Parliament a place that is hospitable to women. Is that possible within the current sort of structural issues that we're dealing with? Okay, I'm just going to jump in and say the first voice you will hear is the moderator for this little debate from 2015, Ann Kingston from Maclean's.
Okay, that takes us actually to the news of the last year and a half out of Parliament Hill. That has been a steady parade of stories about this, everything from Chrystia Freeland being upbraided for having a little girl voice to actual cases involving sexual harassment and allegations of sexual assault. I mean, what we're talking about here is a climate that is not exactly hospitable to women, and certainly not a job description that a lot of women might want to rush towards. I'm curious, knowing in the current election, as we move into the federal campaign, or, well, we're actually in it, what effect has this had? Are you feeling this? Are you feeling that the increased transparency around this problem has actually been something that cast light and created a conversation? Has it been an impediment? And there's also talk about, the idea of sustainable legislatures, making Parliament a place that's hospitable to women. Is that possible within the current sort of structural issues that we're dealing with in terms of Parliament? So, sort of a double-barreled question, but I'm curious about where you see the sense out there, just the pulse of the country.
I think it is absolutely possible to make legislatures and parliaments more hospitable and more open for women and for others. It has to be. You're not going to have the kinds of laws and policies and changes in the country unless women are there in full force. So the interesting thing is that in 1982, Margaret Mitchell, who was the NDP MP from out in Vancouver, stood up in the House of Commons to talk about about women being about wife assault, and she stood up to talk about that. There was a report out on it, and nobody could hear her because the cat calls and the shouting was so intense that she couldn't be heard. And it is a little bit alarming to think that that was 1982, and some things have changed, but not enough has changed. So I hear stories, I'm sure others do too, I hear stories every day about the kinds of experiences that women have in Parliament. And in particular, I have to say, often it's younger women that experience it the most. And I think it is a bit of, I think when a woman or particularly a young woman comes in and is elected for the first time, it's a little bit of a shock to find out how different Parliament is from many other experiences. I mean, I think the feminist movement has had a real impact, for instance, on universities and other places. And so if you come from a milieu where there's a little bit, I think, more awareness about some of these things, and you go into Parliament and see that there is a little bit of a throwback there, but having women in those places makes a difference. I think that the fact that there are women there who have children, there are women there who are pregnant, there are women there who are trying to balance things with their families, creates a momentum for changing things like the hours of sitting and all of that. And some things have changed. It used to be that it was a free-for-all in the House of Commons with respect to debate and alcohol and all of those kinds of things. It is less like that now. So some changes are taking place too slowly, for sure, and much more needs to be done, and one of the ways that will happen is if we have more women elected and taking their place in those seats.
Anyone else?
Just one piece I would add to that. I agree with everything Anne just said. But one thing I would just add in taking it maybe in a slightly different direction is probably the conversation I have the most with women who are thinking about running is less the culture in terms of some of the toxicity that you're referring to that has certainly been there over time, and we each probably have our stories to tell on that front, but even more it's figuring out how they're going to manage their family. And as someone who has a 3.5-year-old in another city right now, it is something that I go out of my way actually to try to bring him along when I can. A little harder now that he's in school, but to be able to, and I love the fact that I can unfortunately only speak to the opposition lobby on the Hill. I look forward to changing that. But I can tell you that between a couple of parties on the opposition side, there are kids running around during votes in those lobbies. And I think it's a great thing to see that it changes the tone, but it also opens it up and says to parents, both men and women, because it's obviously an issue for many men as well. But I certainly have those conversations with women far more than I do with men on how they are going to balance children of different ages, particularly school-age children is a challenge. It's almost easier when they're babies, and then of course when they're older. But it's what do you do when they're in school? Is a constant refrain. And if we can start addressing changes around Parliament, like using technology more, and sitting maybe different hours, different days. I don't pretend to be the expert on what all of that looks like, but I think there are changes that could be made that could make everyone's lives a lot easier, and especially women that are facing those kinds of decisions.
I don't think it's only women who find Parliament intimidating. I think a lot of people find Parliament intimidating. It has a long history. It has a long history of being a predominantly male space. I don't disagree with the things that you have said with regard to structure. I think Parliament would benefit from a number of changes in terms of sitting hours, in terms of engagement with constituents in a different way. But for me, I mean, parliamentarians give up their Saturdays in their ridings too, right? They go to 150 events every week. They miss the Saturday little kid events that usually happen on Saturday morning. Exactly. I mean, and there's sacrifices that also have to be made in the business side of things. So I don't think you can necessarily just say that this is a parliamentary problem. This is a problem for individuals in the private sector and the public sector. But I do think that there are a number of changes that need to be made, and Parliament doesn't like to necessarily look at itself. The Board of Internal Economy is very secretive, and I do actually applaud the Liberal Party for bringing the sexual harassment issue to light and having a public discussion with that. It turns out the press gallery is having problems with that as well. So I think that, you know, a number of these issues apply to the public sector and the private sector, and Parliament not exclusively, but Parliament should be able to shine a light a little more brightly on what it does behind the green curtains of the lobbies. And yet there are little kids running around the government lobby too, just so you know.
So again, to recap, the first answer you heard was from Anne McGrath, the second one was from Katie Telford, and the third one was from Michelle Austin. Now, I'm going to ask Julie to respond to what Anne McGrath said.
I do think, I know we've made incredible progress in politics when it comes to women's positions within politics. I think about that example a lot, actually, about a woman telling her experience and how horrifically she was treated. And I believe Trudeau Sr. was one of the people that was heckling her and made some sort of comment. And I contrast that with just a few years ago, MLA in Alberta who stood up crying and put forward a bill around domestic violence and being able to break a lease and get paid leave, talking about her own horrific experience of surviving intimate partner violence and how she got a standing ovation. It was a national story. It really galvanized the House to vote in favor of that bill. That, I think, is an incredible contrast that speaks to the progress that's been made over the 30-plus years since then. But it is still telling that that her comments came out at a time when we were having this awakening around violence against women. And so, how many years is it going to take? How many awakenings are we going to have before we start moving forward? But I have seen clips and heard that particular incident in the House, and it haunts me to imagine someone bravely standing up and telling stories of domestic violence and being treated in that way. It's just horrific. But we didn't get from there to here by accident. We didn't just get there with men deciding they were going to smarten up and be professional. We got there with women getting angry and fighting back and pushing us towards change. It didn't just happen. And that's, I think, it sounds so obvious, but people forget that. I think people think social change just kind of happens, or that the people in power just kind of wake up and realize oh, maybe I shouldn't be shitty. No, white people are held accountable for their racism, and that's how we move towards living in an anti-racist society. Men are held accountable for their misogyny, and then we move forward. So respecting activists is the only way in which we ever make change.
And the second one to speak was Katie Telford, who, of course, now is the Prime Minister's innermost circle in the PMO. Here's Julie's response to Katie Telford's response to the question in the audio.
I don't have children, but most of the women I know do, and that's certainly a factor that women I know think about when it comes to running for politics. And not just the logistics of it, in terms of things like, accessing childcare and being present for your children, but also making your children targets of harassment, targets of vitriol for what you do for a living. There's a lot of reasons why I don't have children, but one of them is I couldn't do the work I do at the level I do if I did. That's not paranoia. I've been approached by many mothers in my life who've told me, if you ever have kids, you'll have to stop doing what you're doing, or, I wish I could do what you do, but I don't want to put my children through that. I don't want to risk their sanity and their safety by doing that work. And I don't think we talk about that enough. And that's not just unique to women, for sure. But, this idea that even in Canada, children are subjected to harassment for what their parents do. And that's absolutely something that women, I think, have to think about. I would hope that men think about it as well. And then just, the toll that it takes to be in politics as a woman. That's assuming you're a white woman. If you're a woman of color, you're experiencing misogyny, you're experiencing racism. And then you just turn that off at, whatever time you've managed to come home and you're present with your children. It takes a toll. It absolutely takes a toll to be in politics. Generally, it's a very difficult job with incredibly absurd hours, but there's also a level of scrutiny that women and folks of color are put under that also takes a toll on children. And I can't imagine what that must be like in the day-to-day grind of politics, but especially I think about in the context of campaigns where, my God, campaigns can get real ugly real fast.
I just want to ask you one more thing about that response. Do you think that subliminally the whole question of motherhood has been tried to keep where it is on the spectrum for the advantage of the conservative thinking people out there? Has there been a conscious effort to keep motherhood and politics as non-compatible?
I think so, but I think women are also in a trap where you can't win, because women like Kim Campbell were also scrutinized for not having children. And then when you do have children and you take a position that you want to be home with them, then that means that you're not being present for politics. But then if you take a position like the Trudeaus have done, where they have nannies, then you're seen as not being ideal either. So I think you just can't win. And the idea that if you are not a mother, then you kind of save yourself. Any woman in this country who doesn't have children will tell you that becomes a bone of contention for people as well. So you're really trapped in a way that men don't have to be. Men are either praised for their role as a father. They either play it up during election times, during campaigns. They really kind of talk about their big families. I remember several politicians who've done that, really kind of talking about, look at my big family and I'm like a grandfather and whatever. And that when women do, it has a different tone to it than it does for men. And I think, but you just can't win. You just can't win as a woman, unfortunately. Whereas like Patrick Brown, for example, like no one ever thought it was suspicious that he's like unmarried, has no kids, was running to be the Premier of Ontario, and yet Kathleen Wynne's entire private life was up for debate all the time, right? Questions about, like, you know, she's a lesbian and she came out late in life, and her kid, and you know, Andrea Horvath's son is heavily tattooed, has long hair, like that's come up as like somehow her response, like just sort of bizarre, or yeah, and even that Doug Ford can respond that his whole platform on women's issues is that he lives in a house with 5 women and that's all you need to know. Like, can you imagine? Like, can you imagine if you were a woman in politics and people accused you, you know, you're a feminist, you hate men, and you said, well, I have 4 sons, so, and then people would just shut up about it? People just shut up the second Doug Ford tells people he has 4 daughters. Like, that makes you qualified to, in many ways, but it doesn't make you qualified for politics. It doesn't mean you have a good policies on women's issues just because you have a wife and 4 daughters. Like, what a bizarre approach to take that's very gendered. You couldn't switch those genders around and get the same response. There's no way.
And very colloquial as well.
Yeah. Yeah, this sort of funny tone of, like, it's literally a joke that I've seen him make several times, which is, well, you know, I was raised in a house of, I live in a house with 5 women, so I'm tough, or, you know, I know everything there is to know about women because I live in a house with 5 of them, like, constantly kind of, I've never seen a woman, and maybe it's happened and it just didn't get the same airplay, I don't know, but I've never, ever, ever heard of a woman being able to say the same thing about her own family. And when I think about examples of when they have, like, you know, Hillary Clinton talking about being a mother and being a grandmother, it was used to kind of play it up like she was too old to be in politics. Meanwhile, she's younger than him. Anyways, it's just sort of it's a trap that women can't win. And any woman I know who's thinking about entering politics and they think about, you know, the role of their family, or maybe they want to start a family, my advice to them is always think about the logistics for sure. Like, do you want to put your kids in childcare? Are you going to get a nanny? Are you going to do like some women have done and like literally bring your baby to the house? Are you going to breastfeed during question period? Like, think about those things, but don't get caught up in the tornado of whether or not it's going to be harmful to your career, because the reality is you have no kids, you have 10 kids, you have 3 kids. If people want to make your womb an issue, they will do so regardless of what you do. So just like, you do you.
And the third response to the McLean's question was from Michelle Austin, who, in my opinion, took the very standard boilerplate conservative response, trying to gray the issue, make both sides equal, and saying it's inherently systemic. This is Julie's response to that. I went into kind of a rant when we recorded this, when I asked her this question, so I trimmed that off a bit, but we jump right in. She's giving credence to what the other women on this panel are saying, but yet she's trying to make it out as something that's not specific. Like this comment about, well, a lot of people find it intimidating, and it admits that it's a male bastion. So does it not affect women more? Now, how is this different from what Lisa Raitt said?
Well, I mean, it seems unrelated, but it's a frustration I endure all the time, where we've spent years and years and years and years, literal decades, generations of women, trying to get our voices heard on the realities of harassment and violence, for example. And for the longest time, we were told, you're hysterical, this isn't happening, you're exaggerating, it's not happening, it's not happening. Now we're getting to a point where people are recognizing that it is a thing, and so now, all of a sudden, they absolve themselves of responsibility by saying, well, this is a problem everywhere. And I could spend 2 hours telling you just concrete examples of that in my own life, where, doing work on campus for 7 years to get a sexual assault center at Carleton, they kept telling us it's not a problem, it's not a problem. We get a center, great. Now we've in this kind of woke state where people recognize that sexual assault is a problem on campus. I can't tell you how many athletic departments, how many administrators I've met with, doing work at the police, how many police forces, how many political parties, like how often people say, well, I mean, it's a problem, but rape culture is everywhere, or it's a problem, but like it's a problem everywhere. Like, what a bizarre shift we've taken, where people are now taking the fact that violence happens against women happens in all spaces to then absolve themselves of responsibility by saying, well, I can't be held responsible because this is not unique to us, and that it happens in different spaces. And then when you do want to work with them, they say, well, you'll never understand what it's like to be us, and therefore we're going to just come up with the expertise in-house, and we don't want to bring in external people because we have the expertise in-house, which is something that comes up a lot in the context of politics. Like she said, we don't like to look at ourselves. It's such like incredible mental gymnastics to absolve yourself of responsibility that I actually kind of applaud it. Like it's really actually a sophisticated way of sounding rational to say we shouldn't have to be held accountable or held to a different standard than everybody else because everybody is wrestling with this problem. And I kind of applaud it because it's like, wow, you're full of shit, but like it sounds really sophisticated. But when it comes to politics in particular, I just don't have any patience for it. Like you are leading this country. You create laws. You literally dictate my everyday life. You get to decide what kind of media I get to consume, what my streets look like when I walk down them, what my education system looks like, and you're going to sit there and tell me that like, oh my God, we're just so powerless in addressing this problem, and like, it's not just women, and it's not just, it's not women and men. Like, I've got no patience for it. You have so much power. And I really encourage people whenever they hear, it's not an issue of women, it's women and men, and, we're all impacted. I hear this a lot in the context of sexual violence. You sound as idiotic as the person that says that racism impacts everybody, including white people. Like, no. Hard no. It does not happen. Statistically, men are not experiencing anywhere near the rates of sexual violence as women are. And even when they do, it's at the hands of men. Yes, overall, men are more likely to experience all forms of violence, but at the hands of other men. Women overwhelmingly experience violence at the hands of men, which means it's not our responsibility. And so the idea that we're all impacted equally and everybody's going through this and like, why are you guys being so mean to us? And like, it's not just about women, tells me that you don't know what the hell you're talking about, and tells me that those people need to take a seat and let experts into the room to clean up the mess. Because if we're just going to let those people fix quote unquote politics, then nothing's going to get fixed. It's going to be a lip service exercise where they're going to check off a bunch of boxes and they're going to walk through the door the same way they always did. And I got no patience for it.
I agree. All I get from that response from the Conservative Party representative is let's kick the can down the road a little further. Now, from that, we look at something like Our Movement, which is funded by the Federal New Democratic Party, online and otherwise. It is being fronted by Member of Parliament Nikki Ashton. What it is a program of online sessions that cover the entire spectrum of the political system. Canvassing, fundraising, office and logistical work, candidacy, getting on your EDA board, everything. They're exposing women to every part of the machine because, as anybody in politics knows, there are 20 times people behind the scenes for what you see on CPAC or on your 15-second sound bites on the news. So that seems to be a very different way of publicly showing that they're committed to full engagement and full involvement for, as you said, 51% of the electorate. Why are they the only ones that stand out like this?
Well, I think it's important to note that it's not the party, it's Nikki. A few years ago, at the height of Harper really coming down hard on the women's movement, Nikki hosted a women's forum that hundreds of women came to. I wasn't able to attend because I was out of town for the inaugural one, but the room, from what I was told, was electric. People were so excited that there was maybe an opportunity to revive the women's movement. I mean, I can't emphasize enough how much Harper desecrated the women's movement, the long-term impacts of which I think we're not even near being able to measure. I mean, an entire generation of women were led to believe that you could never get paid to do work to improve your own life. I mean, I can't emphasize enough how much Harper set women back. And so at the really kind of the peak of that moment when the women's movement was just deflated, defunded, exhausted, feeling like we were on life support, she held this women's forum that, was branded, absolutely, but it very much was inclusive of any woman who cares about advancing women's issues in Canada. And so for me, this new transition to giving women practical skills for running in politics is a natural transition for her. I admire Nikki's politics a great deal. I think she would have been an incredible leader for the federal NDP party, because I think she's really shown that women need tangible things in order to succeed. It's not about having kind of a circle jerk conversation where we all pat ourselves on the back for how much we care about women's issues, but women's movements need money. They need support. We need legislation advancing women's issues. We need policies and procedures and all of these kinds of things. And this new project focused on giving women those practical skills is invaluable. I mean, if you think about it, running for politics, I mean, I'm pretty politically involved. I have a master's degree. I've been in this movement for a long time. I couldn't even tell you how to start to run. I truly couldn't tell you. I don't know how you become a candidate. I don't know how you fundraise. I don't know what the rules are around fundraising. I don't even know where you get those lawn signs printed from. I couldn't tell you a damn thing. And I'm pretty educated in this area. And so I think we also underestimate how much there's knowledge is necessary to run for politics. It's not just about having really good ideas and some income. It's also knowing the ropes. Yeah. And giving people an opportunity to learn those ropes is a gift. It really, really is.
Oh, absolutely. I agree that Nikki Ashton is a force, but I also think it's important that the federal New Democratic Party is paying the overhead for this entire issue, and they're staying on the sidelines. And if you take the time to go to the Our Movement website, you see all the people on this team. They are formidable women who know politics, and they know a woman in politics. I think that's the big difference. But yet we see the NDP basically embracing it and staying out of the way because they're a political party. They're not branded as being feminist or of women only, so they get it. You move to the Liberals, you see, yeah, there's a little bit of education and stuff, but you have to prove to us you're a Liberal first. And then you get to the Conservatives, and they just stick to the meritocracy argument, just show up, pass our purity test ideologically, and then we'll see if we can work with you. Is there any way that there's going to be more advancement from the traditional party standpoints? How far do you think Trudeau is willing to go further as the election gets closer in 2019, or is that a wait-and-see thing?
I think it's a wait and see. I think everything that you just said illustrates for me why I just cannot get jazzed about partisan politics. It's why we see so many women running for things like municipal government. I mean, there's a couple reasons for that, but one of them is it's not partisan. You're just running as an individual, so it really becomes up to you and what you contribute. You don't have that extra gatekeeper to who's going to vet whether or not you're eligible. It's up to you to decide whether or not you think you're an eligible candidate in your particular riding. Because, partisan politics exhausts me. And living in Ottawa, I'm just so bored of it. And it's why, even myself, why people sometimes can't quite figure me out, because my work is so, truthfully nonpartisan. I've worked with every single party on issues of violence against women. There isn't a party in Canada with a better track record for abortion issues than the Bloc Québécois, for example. I worked heavily with the Bloc Québécois on reproductive rights issues. Most people wouldn't think of that, but they're the ones who 100% on every single bill have voted in favor of abortion access. The world of federal and provincial politics, and territorial politics, there's just so much partisan nonsense that, that pattern is how you can see the old boys club being reproduced. Why we're seeing, regardless of gender, so many political dynasties in this country right now, right? Everything from Jack Layton to Mike Harris to the Trudeaus to Jim Flaherty's wife. So many people in politics are already connected to politics through a spouse or through a family member. And that leaves a lot of us in the dark. That leaves a lot of us ineligible or thinking that we're ineligible because we don't have the chops for it, or we think we don't have the connections and the networks. Well, networking is a gendered experience. Women asking for money in any context get very different answers from men asking for money, whether you're talking about women asking for raises in the workplace or asking for someone to donate to their campaign. It's a very gendered experience, and I think that's part of what makes partisan politics so toxic for women in particular, and folks of color and disabled folks and poor people, because there's really that sense that like it's a club and you got to act like us to get in the club. And maybe once you're in, we'll kind of let you kind of go a little bit rogue or maybe push us in a different direction, but you kind of got to play the game before we'll even let you in the door. And then if you get there and you decide you don't love it, then you're a turncoat, you're disloyal, right? Like all of those things. Meanwhile, it could be that you've just decided that party's not for you, or that your politics have changed, and you know the other party across the aisle has changed their direction and it looks appealing to you now. Like why that's viewed as a bad thing baffles me. But that's part of this, why so few parties are willing to do what Nikki's done, because they're like, well, how does this help the brand?
Yes.
And we don't want to help women succeed for other parties. Like, I'm not interested in running strong candidates who are going to then run against me. I'm interested in building up my house, and that's going to leave a lot of people in the dust.
Oh, that ties in so well to something I've said on the show I don't know how many times over the years. The root of all evil are political parties. Now, here's something I just thought of. Do you think that women stand to gain more as a group than anybody else if proportional representation was to come into effect in Canada? Yeah,
I do. I think women, folks of color, disabled folks, poor people, absolutely. I think we stand to gain quite a bit from changing the system, and I think that's why we haven't. You know, people question Trudeau's feminism on a lot of issues, but I think we should challenge it when it comes to him abandoning the idea of changing our voting system. I was in the House in person during that throne speech, and I saw the energy in the room. I saw the little smirk on his face. I felt the butterflies of excitement when he said, this is the last time we're ever going to have first past the post in this country. I was fired up, and he abandoned that. And I think that's a feminist issue, because it speaks to opening up the doors to letting in different people who are not the traditional people we see in politics. And it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on. Everybody who's not in politics in this country will tell you that system is broken. That's why we have such low levels of voting. People are apathetic because they feel like their voice doesn't matter. And that includes the voices of women.
Yes. Well, I agree with that 100%. But again, you know, as far as electoral reform goes, the reason we didn't get it is because the answer was not the one he wanted to hear. And again, a strictly partisan agenda. If we can't hit that benchmark for partisanship on our scale, then it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the other cause we attach to it is. And I say that's because partisanism has a pillar called misogyny, does it not?
Oh, absolutely. And even look at that file. You're going to take a new, young MP, a woman of color, and you're going to throw her on that file. And you're going to let her think, and then you're going to just reassign her somebody else and send the message that she wasn't qualified to do the job and that it was her fault that it went to shit. Now, yes, another woman came up behind her for sure, but we can't downplay who was assigned that file and how much that had an impact on the perception of it. I mean, Maryam Monsef had to endure people basically like, what, birthism? Like people like their own Canadian version of like, where are you actually from? And like literally she had to like show her birth certificate. Like it was outrageous. And that I don't think was accidental. I think she was thrown under the bus. And that's not fair. That's certainly not fair at all.
Well, yeah, I think it would be a little bit different if, say, Stéphane Dion had been the Minister of Democratic Institutions.
Yeah, of course. Like not just a man, but also someone who was older, who had, you know, was a veteran of politics. It felt like you either didn't take the file seriously by trusting in who you assigned to it, because he had such a laissez-faire attitude to the whole thing, but then really just kind of throwing her under the bus when it didn't go the way that they wanted it to go was so disappointing.
Well, Julie, we know that you are heavily involved with this topic, with this movement, with this societal change that is finally becoming apparent, as it should be. I know you're going to be busy no matter what you're doing. Can you give us any hints on what you'll be doing?
Certainly. I am a self-employed kind of lady about town, which was not purposeful. It's a result of the fact that our movement in Canada was so desecrated under the Harper government that jobs and stability are hard to come by. I think that's a millennial experience in many ways, but it's like almost impossible to get a full-time permanent position doing work to end violence against women in Canada. So I have, my fingers in a couple different pies. I do lots of different work. I think the Me Too movement has really galvanized people in a positive way to think about their own workplace policies and protocols. And so I've been doing quite a bit of that, touring the country, talking to people about how to create a safer workspace. It's work I've done with the NDP, with the Liberals. I tried real hard to get to the Conservative conventions, but weirdly they were not interested. And so I've been doing lots of that, which I find really exciting. I get really passionate about bringing this issue to non-traditional spaces and really kind of talking outside the feminist bubble. I think our conversation today has really kind of shown how exhausted I am with theoretical conversations, and I really like just getting down in the dirt. I also do quite a bit of work around stalking and intimate partner violence. I've been very open about my experience of fleeing an abusive partner and then being stalked for over a decade. There are very few resources for stalking in Canada. Stalking is a very gendered experience, so 76% of stalking victims are women, 58% of us are stalked by a former partner. And so I created a film last fall on my experience and really kind of giving practical tools for survivors and their allies called Outside of the Shadows, All de la Noirceur in French. It's free and up on YouTube. I encourage folks to go and check it out. If you know someone who's in that experience, there's some really practical tips for them. And we don't have a single organization in Canada dedicated to stalking, if you can believe it. And so as a result of coming forward with my story and making my film, I every day hear from women and their allies about their experiences, and they're looking for help. And so I'm looking to launch Canada's first national organization dedicated to stalking so that victims and their advocates have a place to go, have someone to provide them with information, resources, and really practical assistance. So that's something I'm really passionate about because of my own experience, but also just really frustrated that this conversation hasn't been happening, and feeling like why do I feel like I'm the only person with a platform who's talking about these issues, especially in light of all of the chats we've been having across the globe on violence against women as of late. Great progress on lots of different elements of violence against women, but very little to no attention paid to stalking, which is actually a very common experience, particularly for women who've experienced intimate partner violence.
That sounds outstanding. We will look forward to it.
Thank you.
Well, I thank you, Julie, for being on the Via Pier once more. It's been an excellent conversation, and I'm not going to say keep fighting the good fight, because I know you shall, because that's what you do, but good luck with the endeavor to establish a nonprofit for stalking across the country. I agree, it is something that's missing. It's something that should be there. It should have been there a long time ago, but with the momentum, with the awareness that is now with us, I certainly hope that you don't have problems with it and it becomes a going concern.
Thank you. I appreciate the support. I really do.
Julie's a very busy lady. I was lucky to get that much. Thank you very much, Julie. I had a lot of fun recording that. Now, to add to that, to show how she spoke about how this has continued to grow and work its way into different facets of the big picture, I'm going to take a look at a couple before and afters since 2015 to now. I mean, The first thing I'll talk about, November 4th, 2015. That's when the Trudeau cabinet was sworn in. This is from CBC, and you can tell from the tone of it where we were just 3 years ago. As Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's cabinet was announced on Wednesday, there was still debate about whether he made a mistake by fulfilling his election promise to make 50% of cabinet ministers women. Selecting members based on gender rather than on merit alone could backfire, said retired lawyer Naomi Levine. If the women Trudeau appoints don't do it well, then the naysayers will say, he never should have promised that. Women could never do it. The message will be to other women, once you get in there, you will fail, and everybody will laugh at you. Joan Grace, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Winnipeg, is on the other side. I'm hesitant to use the word corrective, but it is a way to facilitate more diversity within our most important decision-making body in terms of federal politics. If there's one thing Levine and Grace could agree on, it was that in situations where there are two candidates of equal talent and ability but different gender, women should be chosen over men. Now, Ms. Levine said, I would say go for the women because you really have to do affirmative action to get women and other minorities up to the level where white men are. Women have been overlooked for decades. But then, Karine Levasseur, also from the University of Manitoba, noted, as Julie did in the interview, some women are still absent from high-profile cabinet roles. Finance, Treasury Board. Now, that was then. What about now? February 5th, 2018. This is from the Hill Times. A handful of ministers in Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's cabinet hosted what was the first ever baby shower for a cabinet minister. Minister of Democratic Institutions, Karina Gould. Public Services Procurement Minister, Carla Qualtrough. National Revenue Minister, Diane Leboutillier. Employment Minister, Patty Hajdu. Indigenous Services Minister, Jane Philpott. Justice Minister, Jody Wilson-Raybould. And Small Business and Tourism Minister, Bartis Chagger, were all in attendance at the small gathering. That's in only 3 years. That's not bad. But the question about who defines feminism and what does feminism even mean to people at large, and if you want to sliver it up into demographics or whatever you want to call it. There's somebody that was very much in the news in Canada in 2015, the defense attorney for Jian Ghomeshi, Marie Henein. February 15th of this year. This is from Sarah Bosfeld. Marie Henein is one of the most polarizing women in Canada, revered by many as one of Canada's top criminal defense lawyers and reviled by others for successfully defending Jian Ghomeshi on 4 counts of sexual assault, expertly dismantling the credibility of each witness who took the stand. While her profile rose astronomically during that time, Henein has flown largely under the radar since then, which made her address at the U of T's Hart House Debate Club all the more intriguing. Before a packed auditorium, Henein spoke frankly about the Me Too movement, which is a subject she said she'd been avoiding for a long time, and gave her thoughts on the unfair pressures and expectations placed on working women. Now, Ms. Bosfeld broke it down into little sections, which works really good for me. On the value of the Me Too movement, Ms. Henein quipped that she imagined many people would expect her to be against a social movement that empowers women to share their experiences of sexual harassment and assault. Not so. Ms. Hennon said, "The Me Too movement, in my view, is a necessary social awakening." And she also included Black Lives Matter into the conversation. These movements are a necessary barometer. Think of it as a social gut check. Their crucial role, she said, is to shake us out of complacency about how we as a society treat women and racial minorities. On the dangers and drawbacks of Me Too. What worries Ms. Hennon is what she sees as a mob mentality that has crowded out the opportunity for critical thought. Proper arguments cannot happen over Twitter, and the rush to judgment and condemnation that happens there doesn't serve the greater cause. For example, she mentioned piling on a feminist like Margaret Atwood, she said, is unproductive and stifling. Piling on is willingly getting into the mud pit and wrestling while everyone else gets off on it. Don't do it. Does the justice system serve women well? Hennon is a staunch advocate of the justice system as it stands and fears the aforementioned mob mentality might erode an infrastructure designed to protect Canada's freedoms and democracy. The criminal courts are not a microcosm of society, she said. Their purpose is to determine innocence or guilt. But, she said, for sexual assault survivors or any complainant within the system, there is a failure to provide information, a failure to explain what's happening, and a failure to manage expectations, because there are limits in terms of what can be done. What we do know is often, for many people, the criminal justice system doesn't give you the feeling you want when you come out the other side. On boosting the visibility of women. Now, this is one of Ms. Hannon's main messages when it comes to turning the tide on how women are treated at work and in society at large. We have to do more so society can see us as leaders. This can be turned around in part by increasing the visibility of women in influential roles and protecting and promoting women to roles they deserve. Feminist prime ministers are fine, but female leaders are better. On the work-life balance and keeping women in the workforce. Now, Ms. Hennon said she refuses to do talks on work-life balance unless they're in front of an all-male audience, because that's who needs to hear it. As far as keeping women in criminal defense law, she said, no one ever leaves a job they're completely fulfilled in. They leave because of external pressures and messages that they need to do it all. You're a shitty mom, and you're a shitty partner, and you're a lousy lawyer if you can't manage to do absolutely everything. Those are the lean-in books that say that. They don't tell you there's 10 nannies standing off to the side. She said she'd like women to have the freedom to pursue their careers as vigorously as men do, and to not be saddled with the enormous sense of guilt that if you aren't home at 4:30 feeding your kids, you're a failure. Now notice that viewpoint and from where it comes. You know, someone at a Toronto firm, partner, very young for her level, outstanding lawyer. Then we go to August 10th, 2018. This is in the National Post. Marie Danielle Smith. The headline is, After Me Too, fear of sexual harassment complaints reigns on Parliament Hill, according to new research. Imagine being afraid to get into an elevator by yourself, not because it's broken down, or because you have a phobia, or because you don't want to lose your cell signal, but because you're genuinely worried that somebody might come in, ride the elevator with you for 20 seconds or so, then accuse you on Twitter the next day of groping them. At least 8 people on the Hill have mentioned male MPs' fear of riding elevators this spring when a researcher did authorized study on what's happening with the culture shift on the Hill. Now, in this as yet unpublished research paper, it focused on conversations with about 25 members of Parliament and 200 Parliament Hill staffers. Rose St. Pierre was who did the work. She concluded that changes in elected officials' behavior have been driven by fear rather than introspection. Meanwhile, staffers still feel vulnerable and don't trust complaint mechanisms, with almost half saying they'd rather find a different job than make a complaint. Now, this is from the conclusion of this research paper by the author. Over the past several months, I have sensed that there is still a taboo surrounding this subject, and that it is an uncomfortable and unclear debate for many people. Sincere and open dialogue about sexual harassment in politics has yet to happen. Now, why did she pick this? Well, as a parliamentary intern this year, she set out to investigate whether any real transformation was underway after Me Too, and naming, for example, Patrick Brown, Kent Hare, and Aaron Weir. Now, the parliamentary internship program annually hires a small group of graduates to conduct research projects of their choice, while they spend 6 months each in a government MP's office and an opposition MP's office. Now, why did she choose this? She said she was skeptical and curious about this idea of a profound change. Staffers and MPs from all sides of the House, male and female, most of them speaking under a condition of anonymity, described to St. Pierre a skittish atmosphere where male politicians worried about stepping into elevators alone or being at the office after hours. Several people told her they were aware of a male MP who is no longer willing to hire female staff. Those changes are related to fear and some misunderstanding of what's going on, and the idea that the price to pay if you're wrongly accused is super high. So they're not even reflecting on the problem of sexual harassment on the Hill. They're thinking, what if I get wrongly accused? And that is their main focus. The sheer volume of commentary about not riding the elevator alone was shocking. Of the 25 MPs St. Pierre interviewed, almost half expressed confusion as to the definition of sexual harassment. A little more than half felt they were seeing changes in behavior, with 9 MPs describing it as people being more on their guard, and 7 of them saying there is a climate of fear. There's a quote from an anonymous MP in the research paper who said they received advice when they first arrive on the Hill to never go out by themselves, and they have continued to pass this advice along to others. People are very much on their guard, and it has been difficult to have frank, intelligent conversations about sexual harassment. Among the 200 staffers who participated in the research, 58% worried that their reputation would suffer if they made a complaint of sexual harassment. 54% reported not even knowing how to make a complaint. 49% say they would worry about causing a media frenzy, and 44% said they would rather just find a different job instead of complaining. So, despite what we hear, and despite the momentum that does exist, and despite what's happened on the Hill with the charges and the demotions and everything else, and Patrick Brown, still, kind of sounds like behind the scenes, there ain't much change yet, is there? We'll see what happens. Had more, but didn't get to it. Thank you very much to Julie Lalonde for a great interview. There will be no The View Up Here for the rest of August. Your host has his holiday. Enjoy the rest of your summer. Thank you for listening. Good night.